it's interesting that we heard this news lately that Skybridge is filing a spot Bitcoin ETF, and I wonder why is this the case? Why do you think things have changed this time around? What's different?
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me on, Christine. It's a pleasure to be here. Like you said, I'm a partner at Skybridge, also run our SALT business, our global conference business as well. But yeah, I can't comment directly on whether or not Skybridge and First Trust are refiling its Bitcoin spot ETF application. But what I can say is we are constructive on eventually there being an approval of such a spot Bitcoin ETF. You know, we are not necessarily hopeful that this wave of applications coming up for review in early July are necessarily going to get approved. We think the SEC and the government in general is becoming more constructive on the idea. I think if you look at the SEC's mission, it's really to protect the little guys, to protect the small consumer. And in this case, converting GBTC to an ETF would be a positive thing for consumers. It would solve some structural issues that we're seeing continue sort of unravel within crypto markets. So it's something that I can't comment on directly about our activities for regulatory reasons, but you know, we're constructive on that space and are hopeful that eventually a spot Bitcoin ETF is going to be approved.
I wonder why you believe that the SEC will become more constructive on converting GBTC to a potential ETF. I mean, they've long said that they're concerned with market manipulation. Do you think that crypto firms or entities can convince the SEC somehow that they can alleviate those risks, concerns?
Yeah, again, I don't think you can alleviate every concern that's raised by every policymaker or politician or anybody. But I think, again, you just look at what the SEC's mission is. I think actually a Bitcoin futures ETF leaves more room for different types of manipulation as well. And I think when the consumer wants something, you know, Anthony Scaramucci, our founder and managing partner, uses this analogy a lot. The cab industry didn't want Uber and politicians didn't want Uber, but there was a tidal wave of support from consumers for what was a application that would help them, you know, live a more convenient life and be able to travel more easily and things like that. And that was the rise of Uber. I think you're going to see the same thing with the spot Bitcoin ETF. I think you're going to see mounting pressure from people, from consumers. You're going to see mounting pressure from their elected officials. And ultimately, the SEC is going to have to make a decision about whether allowing something like GBTC to continue to grow at this massive discount that it's trading at and to grow in what is ultimately a fairly high fee product, whether delaying and not approving a spot Bitcoin ETF is going to be the best thing for the consumer. And we think if you look at that analysis, it's definitely in the best interest of consumers. And you know, there are some questions about manipulation that we think are somewhat unfounded. But I think ultimately, if they make that risk reward calculation, they're going to decide that a spot Bitcoin ETF should be approved at some point.
That being said, taking a look at Bitcoin, it's been pretty down lately at the $21,000 level. And shorts are very popular. So I'm wondering, what is your outlook on Bitcoin?
Yeah, you know, I laugh when a lot of these investment banks start downgrading stocks and downgrading or people starting to get short currencies at these levels. You know, I know Goldman just downgraded Coinbase to a sell after it had drawn down by about 75%. You know, those indicators tend to be lagging indicators that often signal a bottom. And I think as you see people start to pile into shorts for something like Bitcoin, I actually think that in a lot of cases ends up being a contrarian signal. So I think what we saw some sort of idiosyncratic events take place with Terra Luna unraveling. We saw it with Celsius, and then we saw with Three Arrows, what we thought at the time with Three Arrows was a hedge fund that had a little bit too much leverage unravel. What it really was a, you know, I don't want to use hyperbolic language, but it was a much more nefarious situation than that. And the really aggressive selling that we saw last weekend that took Bitcoin well under 20,000 and took Ethereum into the triple digits was really the unraveling of a massive scheme that we didn't realize quite the extent of it until details have continued to trickle out over the last week or so. So again, I think ultimately the decision to start downgrading stocks like Coinbase and for people to start piling into shorts at Bitcoin when it's down, you know, 70% plus from the highs actually often is a sign that we think a bottom could be near. I'm not saying a bottom is in, but I think those are often contrarian bullish signals.
You're not saying a bottom is in, which is interesting because the problems with their Three Arrows Capital, they're working themselves out right now. And if they were to go bankrupt, if Celsius were to go bankrupt, I mean, that could potentially bring the markets a leg lower. Is that a concern of yours? Is there a contagion effect that might be, a concern?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you look at something like Celsius or something like BlockFi that are somewhat in distress right now and trying to figure out the future of what equity holders and how they're going to be made whole in that process. But ultimately, I think the people that have come in to hopefully have an orderly liquidation of those assets and make sure that consumer assets are in good hands are more concerned about the consumer. And in that case, I don't know that you have a lot of users of these platforms that necessarily want to liquidate their holdings. What you're seeing is you're seeing people like Sam Bankman-Fried at FTX coming in and structuring support for these companies, offering credit lines, and potentially speculation is that they might look at absorbing some of those assets down the line. But I think at the end of the day, they're trying to safeguard the consumer. They don't want to force people to sell that don't want to sell their assets. And so ultimately, I think we'll find an orderly solution to some of these situations. Three Arrows, again, as that situation continues to unfold, I think they owe a lot of money to a lot of different counterparties. I don't know how that ends up affecting the prices of certain crypto assets, but they were liquidated. The principal they had was liquidated across various counterparties last weekend, like I mentioned, that led to that big whoosh down that we saw. That at the time we were talking internally about what was causing this massive escalation of the selling, and we didn't know for sure. There were some rumors out there about hedge fund failures and things like that. But what it really was Three Arrows getting phone calls from various counterparties that were saying, "Hey, it's time to call in these loans." And Three Arrows was absolutely ghosting everyone. And so, again, that was sort of an idiosyncratic event, the long-term capital management moment. Obviously, I'm not the first person to make that comparison, but something that I think that was, I don't know if it was full capitulation. You might see another leg lower as you see some additional hedge funds start to unravel. But, for people like us that we don't use leverage, we've stayed away from situations that were inherently unstable like Terra and Luna. We never got into any of these lending protocols that were yielding unsustainable amounts. So we're continuing to be patient. We're not selling any of our crypto assets.
Interesting. So we did pull up that tweet that Skybridge said about SBF being the JP Morgan of the crypto era. And I'm wondering, because they're offering $250 million of revolving line of credit to BlockFi from FTX. Voyager Digital is getting a $200 million credit line. Is this a good thing, or should risky crypto projects fail?
Yeah, I mean, I think they ultimately will fail in terms of the companies that were engaged in these projects will fail. But I think what Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, among others, are trying to do is to provide a backstop for those customer assets. It's more of an altruistic decision rather than a business decision by FTX. There's all these people out there who criticize the fact that maybe the industry is going to become a little bit more centralized if FTX is out there as the lender of last resort. In certain circumstances. But I think at the end of the day, again, Sam's goal is not necessarily to stockpile assets. He doesn't necessarily want to grow his headcount or grow the remit of the FTX business that quickly. But what he wants to do is safeguard an industry that he thinks is extremely important for the future of financial inclusion, for the future of the decentralization of our financial system. And so, yeah, is it great that these companies can engage in this type of nefarious activity and not be held accountable? If that ends up being the case, yes, it's not great. But I think there is going to be accountability. There are potentially going to be some bankruptcy-like situations, hopefully that are fairly orderly, where the leaders of these schemes are held fairly accountable for their actions.
Finally, John, just one last thing I wanted to bring up. Arcane Research showed a couple weeks back that Canadian purpose ETFs saw massive outflows of almost 25,000 Bitcoin in mid-June, which is the equivalent of a 51% decline. And that may have triggered Bitcoin's move below 18,000 a couple of weekends ago because of a forced seller and a huge liquidation. I just wonder your thoughts on this because it's an ETF and that's kind of your line of business. Where do you think this came from? Is it from someone highly leveraged, like a hedge fund? Where does this come from?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, but what I think it does do is it chips away at this narrative that the existence of Bitcoin ETFs somehow allows people to manipulate the price of Bitcoin higher, and that ultimately if you approve a spot Bitcoin ETF, you are submitting to these people that want to use an ETF as a means to drive the price higher. I think when you have full price discovery in the marketplace, when you have open markets, You allow people to buy and to sell and to redeem from these types of ETFs as they so choose. Again, I don't know specifically what caused the unraveling of this ETF, but I do think it's healthy to have products out in the marketplace that operate in a way that's friendly to consumers and allows for open price discovery.
But is it unstable? Just seeing this and the impact it had on Bitcoin?
Is the Bitcoin ETF marketplace unstable, or is Bitcoin itself unstable?
I guess a bit of both.
I think, again, Bitcoin is, even though it's over a decade old, is still in its infancy in terms of mainstream adoption. I think anybody that tells you to invest into digital assets without also coming with the caveat that this is a highly volatile asset that is going to, it's going to experience high volatility on what we think is a long-term road higher is lying to you. We at Skybridge, we are a traditional asset manager that has moved very heavy into the digital asset space. So we approach these things from a very institutional and from a very sober perspective, to be honest, which is, don't invest in this asset class. Don't invest with us unless you expect to experience extremely high volatility. We think the arc of this industry is moving significantly higher. We think adoption is going to continue to increase over time. Certainly, some of these sort of idiosyncratic failures that we've seen with Terra and Luna and Celsius and potentially with BlockFi are detractors from what we hope is a more decentralized financial system built on top of Bitcoin and Ethereum and potentially alternative coins like Solana and Algorand, which we also like. But these are volatile assets. They're in their infancy in terms of adoption, but we think they'll continue higher.